and start.
Okay. Dear friends of Ukraine, welcome to US-Ukraine Security Dialogue 18. My name is Walter Zaryckyj. Over the last few months, I've had the honor of being the events program coordinator. Today, I will have the privilege of being its host moderator. Before we begin our first session with its distinguished speakers and then on to our very rich schedule, let me ever so briefly explain what we traditionally do at the beginning of security dialogues. One, the why factor, and two, the how factor. Now on to the why factor. Why, what we're trying to accomplish today. The Security Dialogue series is a part of a larger series of forums, seminars, symposia dedicated to taking measure of Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic ambitions, precisely bilateral ties to US, bilateral ties to Canada, eventual integration into EU, and ultimately membership in the premier alliance of alliances, NATO, that was first professed in 2000 by both the executive and the legislative branches of Ukraine, and was eventually backed and endorsed in bipartisan fashion in the United States between 2000 and 2004 by the late Clinton administration and the early Bush administration. The first security dialogue was held in 2005 in the wake of the Orange Revolution with all of its marvelous goals, meant to underscore the sincerity and irreversibility of Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic professions. It set two key and co-equal markers for all future security dialogues. One, divining the depth of possible US-Ukrainian bilateral cooperation in security matters, and two, monitoring the pace of Ukraine's accession into the NATO alliance. In addition, it took initial steps with regard to the first marker, US-Ukraine ties, by talking about joint operations I-4K4, Iraq, and eventually Afghanistan. Security Dialogue 2 and 6 took on the issues related to the second marker, reflecting a variety of NATO-UA partnership endeavors in the past and anticipating a membership action in Ukraine either in Riga in 2007 or in Bucharest in 2008. The excitement was almost palatable. Unfortunately, as everybody knows and often laments, the anticipated moves were never made. The map offer stalled first in Riga and then more definitively in Bucharest, where Putin famously convinced the Western coming to power of the Yanukovych regime, which in short order gave NATO membership, took membership off the table and radically reduced any EU membership goals. This initially put a halt to the Security Dialogue series and then produced three events, Security 3 to 5, that sought to see that there might be something salvageable, at least with regard to the Security Dialogue series. In other words, the eventual forum spoke of possible US aid on economic security and energy security issues to Ukraine, but avoided anything military. Again, as we all know, the events from 2013, this would be called the second era of the security dialogues. Again, we all know the events from 2013 to 14 brought seismic changes as big as those of the 7 to 10 period in the history of the dialogue series. The Euromaidan fully and emphatically reconnected Ukraine to its quest for EU and NATO membership. It also brought back the issue of closer US-Ukrainian bilateral ties, indeed with a vengeance, but this time with a rather nasty and ironic twist. Russia, recognizing the glacial shift Ukraine might make in the aftermath of the Euromaidan, took Ukraine to war, even if in its less formal or hybrid form, in the process creating not one but two conflict zones, namely Crimea and Donbass. So no longer could we talk about Ukrainians and the US doing joint missions in Kosovo or Iraq or Afghanistan. We were talking about what the US and Ukrainians ought to be doing about Crimea and Donbass. Security 6 and 15 reflected the new reality called the third epoch. There was basically talk about the old markers, but the US-Ukraine cooperation essentially dealt with what was happening in Ukraine. 6 to 10, running from 16 to 21, done under different presidencies, both Ukrainian and US, began in the spirit of SD-6, with the attention primarily focused on Russia's containing Russia's incursion. But the containment process, once aid went from SOCs to training US-Ukrainian naval and air cadres or giving javelins, was a troubling sign to Russia. So with those 6 dialogues, Vlad the Mad took notice. By 2021, he became convinced that it was either now or never with Ukraine. Any more US-Ukraine or US-NATO chumminess, and Ukraine might be irretrievably lost. And hence, in February 2022, he launched a full-scale invasion. The ploy clearly did not work, as the next 3 security dialogues from 2022 to 24 would testify. Discussion of aid from the United States and NATO to Ukraine as the war progressed went from javelins and cadre training to supplying Abramses, Leopards, Challengers, HIMARS, Bradleys, Patriots, F-16s, Storm Shadows. Heck, by 2024, as 16, Security Dialogue 16 reported, Ukraine had more NATO equipment in country than many European NATO countries. And as outside observers might even say that US, NATO, and UA were the same team. But as the year progressed, and this is where I'm going to end this long thing, as the year progressed, folks noticed the US election cycle and a new phenomenon that emerged, one that no one had honestly anticipated even during the first Trump administration, that the US might someday be reassessing the value of Ukraine heading west and eventually becoming a valuable member of the Euro-Atlantic security domain. That phenomena turned out to promise to be more dramatic and impactful than the Bucharest decision in 2008. In both instances, the organizers truly understood that there might be troubling times ahead, but they forged ahead thinking that the dialogues themselves would create the instruments, the folks that have been attending our dialogues, to reverse some of that policy. What the organizers did not fully anticipate is that Ukraine's goalposts, and this is where I end, with ever tighter bilateral US-Ukraine relations, a la ties of Korea, Japan, and Israel, Taiwan, and Australia, or even an eventual full tie to NATO, as promised in the Senate resolution of 2008, might simply be fading, disappearing into endless Vietnam-era talks, attempting to imitate fruitless Munich 38 peace talks. Even more distressing, some would have imagined that the United States might be rethinking the whole concept of NATO and the European community itself. And this at a time when the Ukrainians, those MacGyverenkos, were trying to embrace all those values. And so all of this is putting our conference today in a very important context. We don't think the United States has walked away necessarily from NATO. We don't think, man, that the Europeans will not own up to what they have to do in Ukraine. But we do have this shadow on top of the shadow of the conferences we've done, and many of you have been participants of that, of the conferences we've done in the last 4 years. There is the troubling situation of not just looking at the capacities of Ukraine to defend itself, and is it doing a good job, but also that larger political question. And I'm going to leave it to all of you. I'm very sorry that I did take this much time, but I will say this. Moving from the why to the how, very simple. Our main speakers will have 10 to 15. Our chairs in the panels will have 6 to 7 minutes on discussion. Our discussants will have 10 minutes, 10 to 12. And then we will open, if we keep the regime correct, we will open the discussions for 15 minutes of discussion. I'm begging the chairs to make sure that they harvest questions so they can then present those questions to the discussants, who will then answer them. And with that, I now would like to open up this conference formally by introducing 2 individuals, but I'm not in charge of introducing the wonderful individual in Ukraine That's the job of the chair. I will introduce the chair by simply saying Adrian Karatnycky, from the time that he was at the AFL-CIO and did work with Reagan and the Pope and Lech Wałęsa in that job, and then on to Freedom House and on to all these different things that he's done for Ukraine in the last 25 years, is the most knowledgeable character you can have about Ukraine generally. He's basically a historian of modern Ukraine, of contemporary Ukraine. And he's written a book. And when you read the book, and that's all I'm going to do before I give it to Adrian, he knows how I feel about that book. That book actually is almost autobiographic, because he was in on all those different events that Ukraine went through from 91 to 2026. So with that, Adrian, I'd like to introduce you. I will do 1 second. There is someone in this room who is as important as the panelists that we have, and that is Yaroslav Brushuk, who was DCM for a long time in the United States. And I think that DCMs in Washington turn out to be the folks that eventually become the foreign ministers of Ukraine. Pana Brushuk, I want to welcome you and thank you for having come with us.
Thank you, Walter. Does that mean I take over now?
Yes, you can. Yes, okay. You can. Thank you.
So thank you, Walter. Thank you, audience. We're convening on the first day of the 5th year of Russia's all-out war to eradicate the Ukrainian nation through physical annihilation, the destruction of its identity and culture, and the destruction of its democratic state. Walter has assembled a very impressive team of policy experts, but more importantly, among them are combat heroes and war veterans. And it is an honor to be in their company. And I think that their participation is a tribute to their support of the courage of the Ukrainian people, and also of the courage of our first speaker, who himself is a hero of Ukraine and a military leader. He is Oleh Shyriaiev, a major who leads the 225th Special Assault Regiment of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Now, where I live in Manhattan, and I'm speaking from Manhattan, nearby, there stands an imposing Beaux-Arts armory of the 69th Infantry Regiment. On its facade, it takes up an entire city block. On both sides of the facade, one reads of the names of the great battles that it has fought. Names that Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, Appomattox, Champagne-Marne, Aisne-Marne, Chateau Thierry in World War I, Saipan and Okinawa in World War II. These names resonate in the minds and in the hearts of every American man, woman, and child. When looking at our first speaker's bio, we see a similar litany of places no less resonant to Ukrainians: Shirokine, Kharkiv, Slobodyansk, Bakhmut, where Major Shyriaiev fought the Wagner Group, Makiivka, Kupiansk, Horlivka, the Battle of Chasiv Yar, the invasion of Kursk, where he took on the North Koreans. Everywhere else, of course, he took on the Russians as well, and most importantly, Gulaipole. These names will resonate in Ukrainian history no less than the names of those battles that stand etched in the minds of Americans, because Ukraine is shaping its present as well as its future and creating legends. Our first speaker is one such hero. His accomplishments are numerous. He has served both in the early stages in the aftermath of the Maidan Revolution, when Russia made its first efforts to seize territories and to break up and destroy the Ukrainian state. He was involved in quelling the separatist uprising in 2014. He has served in the Eastern Corps of the National Police based in Kharkiv. He was deployed in Donetsk, and I think I've listed all of those major battlegrounds, some in 2014, 2015, but many of them in 22 through 26. He is away from the front for a brief respite and can join us live now. And he has just been in the battles around Hulaypole in the Zaporizhia region, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia region in the southeast. It is a great honor to introduce him. I think that getting someone who comes directly from the front, but who has both the broad perspective and some very interesting thoughts about the nature of combat and the challenges facing the Ukrainian military is a great privilege. And I think it's for us to hear him. And also, I think it's a terrific way of opening up the conference on this beginning of the 5th year of this terrible, terrible war. So, Major Shyriaiev, Oleh, proszę was do slova. Please, I invite you to to make your remarks.
Вітаю. Для мене велика честь бути сьогодні
For
з
me,
вами.
this is a big honor to be with you today.
Перебувати в товаристві стількох видатних військових експертів і стратегічних мислителів.
To be in the company of distinguished military experts and strategic thinkers.
Для мене також велика честь бути серед стількох шанованих колишніх лідерів Збройних сил США.
And also, it's a very big honor for me to be here with former leaders of the American Armed Forces.
Ваша служба заради свободи та підтримка справи України високо цінується нами, тими,
Your
хто
ser-
вже 4 роки
Your service to help Ukraine fight for freedom is very much a value for us.
нами, тими, хто вже 4 роки воює на фронті з початку російської агресії проти України.
For us who've been fighting on the front for 4 years against Russian aggression.
Перша фаза моєї участі в війні припала на період антитерористичної операції.
So the first phase of my service was during the anti-terrorist operation.
Саме тоді я вперше здобув безцінний бойовий досвід.
And that's where I received priceless military experience.
Друга фаза розпочалася з моменту повномасштабного вторгнення Російської Федерації.
And the second phase began with the full-scale invasion by the Russian Federation.
Ця війна триває вже 4 роки.
And this war is going on for 4 years.
Свій шлях я почав в званні рядового солдата.
So my path started from a line soldier.
Це дало мені глибоке розуміння того, як змінюється і еволюціонує війна.
So this gave me a deep understanding on how the war changes and how it evolves,
Особливо на передовій.
especially on the front.
Вдруге, я служу в армії в умовах Великої війни.
So this is the second time that I'm fighting in the military during a large-scale war.
Це дозволяє мені бачити розвиток цієї війни.
This allows me to see the development of this war,
Не лише в часовій перспективі, а й крізь призму особистого досвіду.
not only over time, but also through my personal experience.
Я зі своїм підрозділом брав участь у боях під Харковом, Часовим Яром, Сумами та на Курщині.
So with my unit, I took part in battles by Kharkiv, Chasiv Yar, by Sumy, and in Kursk.
Зараз мій підрозділ виконує завдання на півдні, в тому числі на Гуляйпілі.
So right now, my unit is fighting in the south, in the Hulaypole area.
Я, як людина, яка бачила війну на власні очі,
As a person who has seen war with his own eyes, I can say
героїчні захисники України понад усе прагнуть завершення війни.
so the heroic defenders of Ukraine, first and foremost, they want to see an end to this war.
Але ми боремося за свою свободу, виживання нації і не капітулюємо.
So, but first of all, we're fighting for freedom. We're fighting for the survival of our nation, and we are not capitulating.
Це боротьба за існування нашої держави.
This is the basic existence of our country.
Ми готові зробити все необхідне, щоб захистити наш суверенітет.
So we're ready to do everything that's necessary to protect our sovereignty.
Я хотів, перш за все, розказати, як Росія веде війну проти України.
I wanted to talk about how Russia is conducting its war against Ukraine.
Росіяни прагнуть не лише військового домінування, вони хочуть зламати наш моральний дух.
So the Russians don't only want military dominance, they want to break our spirit.
Їхня жорстокість не знає меж.
Their cruelty is limitless.
Як вам відомо, вони мають набагато більшу чисельність населення і виробничу базу.
So as you know, they have a larger population and they have a larger industrial base.
Це дозволяє їм виробляти більше ресурсів для ведення війни.
So this allows them to produce more resources to conduct the war.
Але попри за це, вони зазнають колосальних втрат.
Despite this, they are taking huge losses.
За 4 роки війни Росія втратила понад 1 мільйона 200 тисяч осіб вбитими, пораненими і зниклими безвісті.
So in 4 years of war, the Russians have lost over 1.2 million men. That's killed, wounded, and missing in action.
Останні 2 роки Росія втрачала щороку понад 400 тисяч вбитими і пораненими.
So in the last 2 years, the Russians have lost over 400,000 killed and wounded.
Ці втрати є свідченням героїзму та винахідливості нашої нації та наших воїнів.
So these losses are a testament to the spirit of our fighters and their ingenuity.
Росія веде війну безжально. Навіть під час мирних переговорів вона систематично атакує цивільне населення.
So the Russians are fighting this war mercilessly. Even during the negotiations, they're attacking the peaceful civilian population.
Тим часом на фронті я регулярно перехоплював переговори, в яких російські командири віддавали накази страчувати полонених українських військових.
So on the front, I have heard many times radio intercepts where Russian commanders give orders to their soldiers to execute Ukrainian prisoners of war.
Ми сповнені рішучості не дозволити злу перемогти, їм не зламати наш дух.
So we will not allow the enemy to win, and they will not break our spirit.
Я пишаюся своєю країною за її винахідливість та інноваційність у боротьбі з величезною армією.
So I'm proud of my country. I'm proud of their resilience, of their innovation and their ingenuity in fighting for their country.
Особливо у сфері використання дронів, які ми удосконалюємо з кожним роком війни.
Especially in the use of drones, which was developed, which has progressed with every year of the war.
Якщо початок цієї війни характеризувався вогнем артилерії та стрілецької зброї, то зараз це війна високотехнологічної зброї.
So in the beginning of the war, it was dominated by artillery and small arms. And right now, the past 2 years, it's dominated by high technology, by high tech.
Масове застосування дронів збільшило кіл-зону і суттєво змінило тактику на землі.
So the massive use of drones has greatly expanded the kill zones and the way the war is fought on the ground.
Я переконаний, ми змінюємо сам підхід до ведення сучасних бойових дій.
I'm convinced that we have changed the way modern warfare is conducted.
Оскільки дедалі більше процесів контролюються дронами, ми застосовуємо нові оборонні та наступальні тактики.
So most of the areas controlled by drones, and we use new types of defensive and offensive tactics.
Ведемо активну радіоелектронну боротьбу. Навчаємо дронами збивати дрони.
So we actively engage in radio electronic warfare. We use drones to knock out drones.
Не можна пересуватися великими групами, лише малими та під підкриттям.
Large groups cannot move. Small groups can only move and only under cover.
Не працюють стандарти евакуації.
The standards of evacuation don't work.
Все частіше єдиний шанс витягнути побратима з поля бою – це наземний роботизований комплекс.
So right now, the best way to pull a brother from the battlefield who's wounded is by using ground robots.
Солдати на позиції можуть перебувати місяць і більше.
So soldiers could be in their positions on the front line for a month or more than a month.
Постачання боєприпасів, води, їжі, медицини можливе лише дронами.
So supplying ammunition, food, water is only possible through the use of drones.
Противник також вчиться і розвивається технологічно.
And the enemy also learns from this, and enemy is also developing technologically.
Як приклад, перші шахеди, які використовувала Росія, були доволі простими.
So, for example, the first Shaheeds that the enemy used were pretty simple.
Їх легко можна було знищити.
It was easy to knock them out, to destroy them.
Але зараз це реактивні дрони, які працюють на різних висотах і можуть керуватися в режимі реального часу.
So right now they are rocket-powered drones that can fly on different altitudes and that are controlled in real time.
Можуть нести інші дрони.
And they can carry other drones.
Ми змінюємо спосіб ведення сучасної війни.
So we're changing the way modern warfare is conducted.
В цій війні працює принцип «еволюціонуй або помреш».
So the principle evolve or die is dominant in this war.
Це стосується всього – тактики, зв'язку, дронів, програмного забезпечення і технологій.
So this has to do with everything: tactics, communications, computer programming, across the board.
Перемагає не той, хто має більше ресурсів, а той, хто швидко вчиться і адаптується.
So the one who wins is not the one who has more resources, but the one who develops quicker and evolves quicker in their technology.
Вважаю, також треба активно знищувати командні пункти та командирів середньої ланки, які безпосередньо керують війною.
So also the mid-level commanding ranks need to be destroyed. These are the ones that actually manage the war on the ground.
Маємо знищувати пункти керування ворожих дронів.
So we have to destroy the operation points of enemy drones.
Ми продовжимо цю боротьбу з підтримкою США чи без неї, бо мусимо це робити.
So we're going to continue this war with the support of the United States or without, because we have to.
Водночас ми й надалі покладаємося на американську підтримку і вдячні за вже надану допомогу.
And also we are very grateful to American support, and we are very grateful for the support that we have received so far.
Ваша допомога відіграла значну роль у нашій боротьбі.
Your support has played a significant role in our struggle.
Досвід України та технологічні можливості Заходу принесуть нам перемогу.
So experience of Ukraine and the technological capabilities of the West will bring us victory.
Нам і надалі потрібна американська підтримка.
So, and we need U.S. support. We need continued U.S. support.
Перш за все зброєю,
First of all, with weapons,
в тому числі далекобійною зброєю, а саме томагавками.
and that includes long-range weaponry, first and foremost, Tomahawk missiles.
Також ми потребуємо допомоги розвідувальними даними і дипломатією.
And we need intelligence support, intelligence data, and diplomatic support.
Ця підтримка необхідна для того, щоб ми могли вести тривалу боротьбу проти армії, яка намагається нас зламати через війну на виснаження.
So this support is crucial when we're fighting against an army which is trying to exhaust us.
Ця боротьба не лише боротьба України, а й всього західного світу.
So this struggle is not only the struggle of Ukraine, but it's the struggle of the whole Western world.
Це боротьба за збереження наших демократичних цінностей і способу життя.
It's the war for the protection of our democratic values and for our free lives.
Дякую вам за честь звернутися до такої експертної та поважної аудиторії та поділитися думками з передової від тих, хто безпосередньо веде цю війну.
Thank you for the opportunity to share my experience with such an esteemed audience. Thank you.
Бажаю всім плідного дня та висловлюю подяку організаторам за підготовку такої змістовної програми. Слава Україні!
I want to wish everybody a good day, and I want to thank the organizers for such a great program. Slava Ukraini. Glory to Ukraine. Героям слава.
Thank you, Major Shyriaiev. We are constrained with time, and you've given such a broad overview of both your combat experience and also broadly about the needs of the Ukrainian fighters and of Ukraine in its war against Russia. But I wanted to kind of talk just very briefly and ask you a question about how the war has changed in terms of, the lethality of combat, given the transfer of much of the combat to drones, the use of robots. Your former commander-in-chief, General Zaluzhny, spoke of the future of combat allowing for the saving of additional lives. Have you found that the experience of war in the last several years, both in your own immediate experience and more broadly what you see, has actually seen some increased measure of safety for fighters on the ground?
Ми маємо певні обмеження стосовно часу, але я хотів запитати вас питання. Як ви бачите ситуацію у війні, як воно змінилося стосовно ураження, використання дронів, використання роботів? Ваш колишній головнокомандуючий Залужний саме про це писав, і базуючись на ваш досвід, що ви бачите, чи фактично, чи солдати, чи вони є більш захищені тепер, а як це все можна оцінити?
Ми повинні винести з цієї війни декілька уроків.
So we need to bring out certain lessons from this war.
Передусім, головний урок – це те, що технології дуже швидко і суттєво змінюють характер війни.
So we have to say the first lesson is that technology very quickly and very substantially changes the character of war.
Очевидний приклад – це дрони.
So the obvious example are drones.
Застосування яких розширило кіл-зону до 50 кілометрів.
The use of drones has expanded the kill zone to 50 kilometers.
При відносно малій вартості дрона, дрон може створювати великі проблеми для сучасних армій.
So, and taking into fact that the drones are of a low cost, they can cause huge problems for a modern army.
При відносно невеликій вартості дрон може створювати проблеми для армії та знищувати особовий склад і техніку вартістю в мільйони.
So a low-cost drone could cause huge problems for an army, can kill and destroy many men and destroy equipment that's worth millions of dollars.
Вирішальний фактор – це інтеграція технологій у повсякденний бій.
So the key factor is the integration of technology in the daily warfare.
Цифровий зв'язок, дрони, програмні рішення та швидкий обмін інформацією перестали бути перевагою, а стали необхідністю.
So communications, the exchange of program information, all of this has become the deciding factor in warfare.
Армія більше не може існувати окремо від цивільного технологічного середовища.
So the army can't exist separate from the civilian technological community.
Армія, яка не змінює підходів, навіть маючи ресурси, поступово програє тому, хто вчиться в процесі війни.
So an army that doesn't change can't develop in the processes of war.
Наступний фундаментальний урок
So the next fundamental lesson.
це розвідка на полі бою має вестися 24/7.
So development on the battlefield has to happen 24/7.
Підрозділи повинні мати достатню кількість розвідувальних дронів і вести постійний стрім спостереження за всім полем бою.
So units need reconnaissance drones, and they need to do a constant live feed, live streaming to see what's changing on the battlefield.
І останній урок – це пріоритет збереження особового складу.
And the last lesson is the priority of protecting the personnel, the military personnel.
Підготовлений боєць є значно ціннішим ресурсом, ніж будь-яка одиниця техніки.
So a experienced soldier is a lot more valuable than any sort of technology or equipment.
Війна змусила переосмислити тактику, тому піхотинців необхідно готувати як універсальних солдатів.
So war has changed the nature of the battlefield. That's why a infantry soldier needs to be a universal soldier.
Кожен від рядового до вищого офіцерського складу має володіти всіма технологіями.
So from the lowest ranks all the way up through the officer ranks, they have to have a knowledge of use of technology.
Major Shyriaiev, I'm being told that we need to move on. We're extremely grateful for such a learned and thoughtful presentation. And I want to say that at the beginning of my introduction, I mentioned the 69th Regiment of New York. That regiment produced many outstanding leaders of the country in the period after war. One such was General Wild Bill Donovan, a very famous leader of our country in the post-war era. I can not help but think that units like the 225th Regiment in Ukraine will produce leaders of similar capacity, including after what we have heard from someone like you. We are grateful for your service. We are grateful for your courage. The Ukrainian people are even more grateful. We stand from here simply in admiration. And we wish you safety, and we wish safety to the men that you lead. And thank you for a very rich contribution to the opening of this conference.
Мені говорять, що ми мусимо завершити, і на завершення я початку почав говорити про саме 69-ту групу в Нью-Йорку і їхні заслуги. І саме з одних тих командирів, який вийшов з тої частини, це був генерал Wild Bill Donovan, який дуже велику роль відіграв в післявоєнний час. І я думаю, що 225-й полк саме буде відігравати таку важну роль в майбутньому, як ця частина Сполучених Штатів. І я дуже вдячний за вашу дуже цінну доповідь на нашому заході. Дуже дякую і дякуємо всім захисникам.
Дякую, слава Україні.
Героям слава. Дякуємо, щиро дякуємо.
Всіх нас дякувати тих, що є організаторами, що виїжджали сюди на річ. Ми знаємо, в яких умовах ви знаходитеся. Дякую дуже. Okay, with that, I am going to now move on to our first panel discussion, and I will ask, it's the first panel discussion, very important, as always, is assessing Ukraine's land force capabilities and needs. And what I would ask is that the following individuals come to the dais. General Kimmitt, I see that you are here with us. George Barros, I've seen that you're with us. I've seen Luke Coffey with us. These are the masters. In fact, I hope that our major stays with us. And General Wes Clark, as always, is General Clark with us? Yes? Okay. I just very quickly, you can see it in the bios in the brochure, but I just simply wanted to compliment the person that's going to be leading our discussion, General Kimmitt, because he's not only a distinguished military leader, but he's a distinguished political leader, or knows the politics of Washington, having been both a deputy assistant secretary of defense and an assistant secretary of state. So I think that, and the others on the panel, this is CNN live right now. This is C-SPAN live. So General, it's all yours.
Thanks, Walter. The other thing he didn't mention is the man on the screen. I worked for 2 times, and that was harder than any of the other 2 jobs I had. So listen, let's start off. Any chance we can get those slides up? Great. I've got 3 introductory slides, and then I will move on. I've been writing about Ukraine for the past 4 years, both in the Wall Street Journal and in Politico EU. And let's see, technology is not our friend just yet. Okay, and today we are talking about this question of taking measure of Ukraine's defense capabilities after 4 years. We would not be doing this assessment if, as the major said before, there are still serious gaps on the battlefield. Obviously, that's the case because the war continues on. First slide.
To the people or General Clark is in.
There's nothing there that General Clark can't handle.
Go there. You can see it now.
Yeah, thank you.
4 years ago, after the war had started, 3 months into the war, 4 months into the war, I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal, and the headline, I think, says it all. The statement is, and the prediction was, a prolonged bloody stalemate. And I certainly hope I wouldn't be right. But the fact remains is the dithering that was done by the United States and others in terms of giving Ukraine what they needed, in many ways led us to where we are now. To use a crude metaphor, the baby was born deformed, and we're now trying to improve it, and which is in general why we have the experts at the table and the experts on the screen. Next slide, please. 20 years before that, Elliot Cohen, who I think most of the people in this room know, wrote an article which has been apocryphal and has stood by me for years and years. This was in November of 2003, and his article, and the title in many ways says it all: If We Cut and Run in Iraq. And in many ways, you could say the same thing if we cut and run in Ukraine. The second paragraph, whatever one's views of the war's rationale, conception, planning, or conduct, our war, it remains, and we need to figure out how to win it. And that's exactly what this panel is all about today. Next slide. And I can't think of three experts more capable of talking about this than, of course, General Clark, George Barros, and Luke Coffey. They're exactly the right people to put a period at the end of this sentence in terms of how to assess what is needed. Now, as the moderator, I've already been told by Walter to speed this up. So what I would like to do is simply move on to the speakers. We will not have questions between the speakers. We will use the time remaining before Walter gives us the flag so that the audience can ask the questions. I will not sit up here as one of those moderators that is trying to be smarter than everybody else and ask the smartest questions. The smartest questions can come from the people out here. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is kick this off and start off with a general who I hold in such high admiration and still quiver every time I think I've got to go up and brief General Clark to this day. So General, why don't you kick it off for us?
Well, Mark, thanks very much for the kind introduction. I'm really honored to be here and part of this great panel. I want to begin by saying to Major Shyriaiev, what a great presentation you gave us. You really gave us a feel for the battlefield. I don't know if if he's here. I don't know if he's got translation. I hope so. But I was especially impressed by the depth of your insight and especially the idea of the value of the individual soldier. What we've seen in the war in Ukraine is the two competing systems that are diametrically opposite. The Russian concept of war is mass. Soldiers are no more valuable than any artillery projectile. When I was doing the US-Russian staff talks in the 1990s, went to Moscow, met with the generals, looked at their training, and as they said, infantrymen, they don't need much training. When we need them, we just put out a call and we pick them up on the street corners in Moscow. And that's the exact opposite of the way that we in the United States believe battles have to be prepared for. And obviously, Major Shyriaiev, you see it the same way. And congratulations to you. And congratulations to all the brave soldiers of Ukraine, the fighting men and women on the front lines, the leadership that has stood the test. We're in awe of you, and we know you're fighting for us. Now let's get to the battlefield. This is not a stalemate. As Major Shyriaiev said, this is a dynamic conflict that is threatening to break open at any time. It's gone from simple first-person view drones and basic electronic jamming to much more sophisticated systems. It's gone from a Russian strike system that didn't have targeting to very precise targets. It's gone from Ukraine that couldn't strike from beyond Donbass into the furthest reaches of Russia to strike critical military targets. It's a very dynamic conflict. And even though it looks static, It is not static, and I wouldn't want anyone to think that it is. We had the challenge of the first person drones from Russia. Then we had the challenge of the fiber optic drones and what they might do to us. We had the problem of what happens when there's obscuration on the ground and the drones don't work so well. We had the problem of jamming and what happens to gimbalers when they are jammed, and maybe ATACMS when it's intercepted. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned here, but one of them isn't that this is a static conflict. So how do we move forward in this? First, I want to say that for the United States, it's been a big learning experience. We have historically neglected electronic warfare. It's been the weakest suite of all our capabilities. We just assumed that, we would own the electromagnetic spectrum. And from the very first battles in 2014, when the Ukrainians were up against Russian broadband jamming that was powered by generators from hospitals and schools that were unattackable, we've found that there's a different way of looking at electronic warfare. So that's one of the major lessons. We have to fight for our share of the electromagnetic spectrum, and we have to keep the enemy away from it. This is an ongoing problem, and we've got to strengthen our ability to dominate that spectrum from space on down to the individual soldier and his ability to communicate, and the frontline ability to jam enemy communications or take intelligence from them. So EW, fires. Ukraine still needs 155 artillery ammunition and mortars. They're doing a lot with drones, but if they had the 155 ammunition that the Russians had, they'd be even further than they are today. If we could keep Starlink away from the Russians, keep them from using mobile phones for communications, jam and target their headquarters and control nodes, we would go a lot deeper, a lot faster, even than we are in Zaporizhia. But to do that, we not only need the electronic warfare and the fires from artillery, but we also need organizational development. General Zaryckyj has begun and worked very diligently to put a core concept in place. This is essential because, as we saw in the offensive in the summer of 2023, without stacking the combat multipliers above and in front of, on behalf of the frontline troops, you're not going to penetrate. So thus far, the Ukrainian effort to organize core support, combat multipliers, and reinforce movement hasn't produced yet the results that we'd like it to be, we'd like to see. The nature of warfare is going to remain the same. We don't aim for a static battlefield. What we want is Ukraine to break through, seize Donbass, run the Russian forces out, and penetrate into and take Crimea. So what's happening right now is preparation in depth for that, if possible. And that is the organizational development of the core concept, the building of reserves, and the ability to handle the immediate battlefield tasks in the meantime. Among innovations I've seen on the Ukraine side are the ability to use drones to breach obstacles. If we'd had that in 2023, we could have gone through those obstacles, but we didn't have it then. And the ability to stack reconnaissance. So you have first line reconnaissance, you have reconnaissance above that, you have ultimately strategic reconnaissance. All that's got to be fed down. In the United States Armed Forces in the 1990s, we made a mistake. We thought, some people thought, that if the Air Force controlled everything that flew, then they could distribute information wherever it was needed from multi-capable, very expensive, large platforms. We know now from the experience in Ukraine, that's not the way to go. So we want to see a proliferation of intelligence reconnaissance assets at all levels, but we want to make sure we distribute the product fully so that at the front line level, they can see deep and see what's coming, deep enough to be able to affect it. The 10 to 15 kilometer deep kill zone, it's really important. So, but where are we going from here? We're going for maneuver warfare on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're moving into new technologies, and there are two of these that are very important. One is the technology for obscuration. We learned at the end of the Vietnam War that what can be seen can be hit, and what can be hit can be killed. This was a great breakthrough of the tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided missile TOW. It was able to make a direct hit. Laser-guided bombs that took out the Tan Hoa Bridge in North Vietnam, 1972. But we've got to be able to work through obscuration, and we've got to prevent the enemy from doing that to us. So we've got to have obscuration. How do we get that obscuration? Partly through camouflage, partly through thermal camouflage, partly through smoke, partly through thermal smoke, partly through smoke generators. But how do we do it on a large area so that we can mass forces to break through? This requires more technological innovation if we're going to punch back at the enemy. Secondly, why don't we use directed energy more effectively? We've had optical telephony for 30 years now, but we're very slow to take those very same lasers and use them for our defense. There are many different things we can do with those lasers besides mounting them in drones or using them for close-in defense. But we need to get into that. And not only invisible wavelengths, but directed energy in terms of electromagnetic pulses and other things. We're just starting with that in the U.S. Armed Forces, but I think Ukraine has the same kind of technical skills and probably can move faster than we can. So I don't want to drag this out. Mark, I think, it's the training of the individual soldier and his courage on the battlefield. It's the proper equipment with and information, intelligence, the ability to support him with fires, the organizational structure to be able to penetrate, and continuing enhancements of things like beam and directed energy weapons. Thank you very much.
George? Can you all hear me? Thank you for the kind introduction.
No, keep that.
That's what, hello? 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 Thanks.
It was, it just.
Yeah, I know. Check.
Hello?
And
Hello?
Russia's.
Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, everyone. As we discuss the requirements for Ukrainian success on the battlefield, I think one of the key predeterminants of that is actually understanding the nature of the current Ukrainian battlefield. And I think there's a significant amount of misunderstanding or rather previous understanding about what the old Ukrainian battlefield used to look like, but not what it looks like in 2026. I think rather unhelpfully, the war has had a lot of comparisons to World War I. That really came out of a lot of the conventional media coverage that occurred. Can't hear in the back. Hello? Is the mic working? Okay. Hello? Oh, there we go. Wonderful. So prerequisite to understanding the requirements for the Ukrainian battlefield is understanding actually what is the Ukrainian battlefield in present year. It's evolved substantially, and I think there's a significant amount of legacy thinking, or rather previous understanding of the Ukrainian battlefield of 22 or of 23 or of 24, and it's substantially different from the Ukrainian battlefield of late 25 and then going into 26. I think if you ask the common person to sort of create the mental picture of how they understand the Ukrainian battlefield, they tend to think of the World War I motif, the World War I metaphor. This is sort of the descriptor that much of the media used to describe the war in 2023 after the failed Ukrainian counteroffensive. You had this idea of the Surovikin line, these vast field fortifications that were held and essentially forces trying to breach them, the maturation of the war out of maneuver and into a positional nature. And I think that was accurate in part and parcel for a segment of the war, but that's certainly not where the war is today. The drone technology, I completely agree with the previous statements. The drone technology is fundamentally changing the tactics and the concept of operation for the war. And it's very fascinating how quickly the Russian and Ukrainian TTPs, SOPs, and doctrines are changing. Just for reference, back in 2022, and this is all the legacy combat footage that was shown for all the anniversary coverage that was in the news yesterday, the Russian basic unit of maneuver was the reinforced battalion, the battalion tactical group, where you would have hundreds of vehicles at a single unit moving, operating. There's a doctrine for how to do that. In current year, the basic Russian unit of maneuver is a reduced squad. It's a team of 3 to 5 individual people. And the front line in Ukraine, where we've matured into a positional warfare, and I completely agree with General Clark, it's not a stalemate. It has a positional nature, and there's an important difference between that, is that we actually don't even have a continuous front line. The front line actually doesn't look like the World War I front line of the Somme or Flanders fields. It's a pointsless front line with a series of interspersed, non-continuous Russian and Ukrainian held strong points, where you might have a Ukrainian team of a few small individuals holding hundreds of meters of front line, and then they'll have a Russian team behind them, a Russian team ahead of them, and maybe a Ukrainian team on the left and a Ukrainian team on the right. And so there really isn't a pointsless front line. And the way that the Russians are actually making their gains today is by sending infiltration teams of 3 to 5 people who use the cover and concealment of the terrain as well as underground infrastructure. Subterranean warfare is becoming much more important, to needle their way through a kill zone dominated largely by drones. The fight's mostly for drone dominance at this point. The Russians then try to essentially anchor down, occupy a position. If they can get into a trench or a field fortification that's held by Ukrainian infantry, then it's about a 50-50 chance fight whether or not the Russians take it. But that's how the Russians fight for these hard-fought gains. And this tactic, it results in gains, but it's at extraordinary cost. The rate of Russian advance, all else equal, for 2025, some months were faster, some months were slower, but the basic daily rate of advance was 13 to 15 square kilometers per day, at an average casualty rate of about 83 Russian casualties killed and wounded per square kilometer gained, with the average daily casualty count being about 1,000 casualties lost. So that's the Russian operational concept, right? And so as we think about how to defeat this system, and I completely agree with General Clark here, the Ukrainians need to do what we call here in the West a center of gravity of analysis to dismantle the operational infrastructure that actually enables a Russian troop to be able to move forward. So the Ukrainians did great. They successfully fixed the problems of 22 and 23, which was we have to stop Russian armored mass. So that's been a success. The Russians can no longer amass a battalion's worth of combat power in the vicinity of the front line and charge it into the Ukrainian lines. That's not a thing anymore. Now what they have to do is go a little bit further and say, okay, how do we deny a Russian group of 3 to 5 infantrymen to be able to needle their way through the front line? And what we've discovered in doing a center of gravity analysis is that actually the Russians enjoy a relative zone of safety once you get behind the immediate vicinity of the Ukrainian drone kill zone. That is, the territory, crudely, it's different in different front areas of the front line, so the tactics will be a little bit different, but crudely, it's basically the area that's like 20 kilometers away from the Ukrainian drone operators and their range. That's where the Russians set up all of their operational assembly areas. So that's where you'll find deeper in the rear, the hardened brigade headquarters, battalion and company headquarters, and the assembly areas, oftentimes underground, where the Russians actually bring all the infantry up, get them the equipment they need, and then stage and pre-position them so that they can then go on these infantry infiltration missions. And now, here's the challenge for the Ukrainians. There's requirements to dismantle this system, but there's also requirements to mature their operational and organizational structures. So one of the challenges that the Ukrainians have, and this is something that the Ukrainians need to fix with our support, is maturing the core system, maturing the targeting system, and getting the Ukrainians from a reactive standpoint to a more proactive standpoint. What do I mean by that? Far too many Ukrainian units and commanders are simply reactive in that they wait for Russian servicemen to enter their unit's area of responsibility, come into their kill zone, and then they kill them. And that's fine and dandy, and they have their work cut out for them. It's a very difficult mission. But candidly, there needs to be a little bit more emphasis on how do we not only just kill the Russians that come to us, but how do we actually degrade the infrastructure that facilitates them coming to us in the first place. And I would say there are some units that are very good at this, but I would say maybe 80% of Ukrainian units are reactive and just accepting and playing a defensive role, and maybe 15 to 20% of units are actually being proactive and thinking about how do we degrade the Russians, not at the tactical front of the spear, but in the operational depth. And again, there are some very good units, so I'm not painting a broad brush here, but that's the general trend. In terms of how to actually now go against the system, once you've actually done the thinking and you've identified the systems and you're starting to go after this stuff, there's an effectors problem, and then there's a sensor problem. So in terms of the sensor problem, a persistent ISR is still a challenge for the Ukrainians. They need the ability to reconnoiter, and identify and track and have custody of targets in the 20 to 70 kilometer range. Certainly they have drones that are able to do that. However, the Russians do have electronic warfare. They do have tactical air defenses. And one of the big asks that they could really benefit from is satellite-enabled communications, so that the Ukrainians can operate drones not just in that 20 to 70 kilometer range, but deeper into the deep rear operational zones where really the Russians do facilitate these things. I think this is a little hyperbolic. It's been described to me as that would be a game changer. I don't think there is a single game changer system, but systems on systems can change dynamics in war. So this is one of those things. Another thing that the Ukrainians really, really need is manpads. It's under discussed and it's not sexy, but Russian drones that actually facilitate the reconnoitering and destruction of the Ukrainians at operational depth, like Lancet and Zaryckyj, those are big problems actually. And so simple systems like manpads continue to be very relevant, as do 155 rounds, as the general mentioned. Top priority is probably anti-aviation activities. We've not been talking a lot about the Russian glide bomb threat recently. That was dominating the headlines in recent years. However, the glide bombs continue to be a major facilitator of Russian advances and Russian gains. And so it's very important that the Ukrainians have the ability to shoot down Russian aircraft and prevent them from being able to launch the sorties, shoot the salvos, the glide bomb, because those are actually key enablers for the Russian infantry advances. What I'd also say here is one of the things that we can work on is actually denying the Russians the technologies that are in the US custody to be able to deny. So I would note that the Ukrainians had an epic win, and the United States had an epic win back in early February when Starlink and Elon Musk shut off and whitelisted. They introduced a whitelisting technology to Starlink to make it so that any Starlink terminal operating within a geofence in Ukraine had to be whitelisted by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. That was a very good policy amendment, and it substantially degraded Russia's networking capabilities. Not decisively, not permanently. The Russians are developing other workarounds, and there are other workarounds, but that was very good. There's an epic fail here too, though. There's a different American company that is helping the Russians with their communications, and it's called Ubiquiti, and they are a small-scale networking company that produces Wi-Fi bridges to be able to help do mesh networks. And unfortunately, this company is actually still actively supporting Russia. There was an excellent investigation into how basically a journalist posed as a Russian military entity. They went to Ubiquiti's order forms that, hey, we're a Russian military entity. We need to get this product delivered to occupied Ukraine. Here's our address. And basically Ubiquiti said, we can't give it to you directly, but we can give it to this entity in Turkey. And then here's how we can facilitate the sale, which is pretty shameful. So these are all fixable problems. It's a surmountable series of problems that can be fixed. We need to think about how to actually degrade the Russian advances. And I don't think it's a far cry to change the daily rate of Russian advance from 13 to 15 square kilometers, get that closer to zero, and enable the occasional Ukrainian counterattack, the likes of which we saw in Kupiansk in November, the likes of which we see in the south right now in Zaporizhia. Thank you.
Thanks, George.
Thank you.
Right.
All right, good morning. Walter, thanks for inviting me back. This is the 18th iteration. I've done many of them. perhaps not all 18, but quite a few. And I also know that spring is almost here every time I sit next to George on a panel. That's how I time my year. So it's it's great to be back to do this. And thanks, Mark, for the introduction. The problem with going last with such smart panelists, co-panelists, is that they usually say everything that you were going to say. And in fact, they said quite a bit of what I was going to say. So I'm going to focus on the areas where I think I could maybe contribute or add some color. And then I think we're going to open it up then after that for questions. I think in terms of the situation of the land forces and looking at the biggest challenge it faces, I think it's personnel management, not personnel as in the actual soldier, but the management of its people. And it's not as sexy as, you know, drones and 155 and, you know, mobility platforms and armored vehicles. But it's crucial to get the force right, because we can talk about the, you know, 21st century warfare and FPV drones and electronic warfare and this and that. But I can tell you that anytime a Ukrainian village is liberated, it's liberated by what's most likely a young man between the ages of, let's say, 24 and 30, who hasn't slept probably in 2 days, who hasn't showered in probably 2 weeks, and who probably hasn't had a hot meal in days, who's very tired and is carrying a pack that weighs about 100 pounds, having just experienced his probably best friend being killed or wounded next to him. So these equipment, these platforms, these drones, these enable that soldier to do what he or she does, but ultimately it's the person that's going to win this war, not just the technology. And how the force is managed is an important question for any large military, certainly so for one like Ukraine, which is large and also involved in active combat in the middle of a war. Managing a force of this size under the circumstances is a bit like building a ship while you're already out at sea. And there are two issues, I think, here with the force, the personnel management side of things. Some are in the short term, some are in the longer term. In the short term, I don't feel like the Ukrainians have really cracked the code or figured out how to manage the system of force rotation on the front line for rest and recuperation, or those who are actually serving on the front lines. And I think this has caused a lot of angst inside the force. There's also the ongoing issues of recruitment and retention, but I think these are not because Ukrainians don't want to fight. The Ukrainians have demonstrated that they're more than willing to fight. I just think there are a lot of question marks for a young Ukrainian when they sign up for, or when they're mobilized. You know, for how long, under what terms, under what circumstances, when does it end? Does it end? And a lot of these questions either perhaps aren't communicated well to the young mobilized soldier or recruit, or these problems haven't been solved. But I think this is one of the biggest issues that's contributing to some of the mobilization issues that Ukraine is facing. In the longer term, I think, you know, God willing, there is a fair and just peace that brings the fighting to an end. There's going to have to be a serious thinking about how do you manage a force of this size? You know, we're talking, you know, you see in the press 800,000, you know, or more people. And how do you institutionalize the lessons that were learned on the battlefield to establish that robust junior NCO corps, junior officer cadre? And how do you know, maintain a force like this, which, you know, for the past several years at least has been used to fairly high op tempo, transitioning to a more like low tempo force structure, and by keeping the training and the attention focused on the front line, because if history tells us anything, it is that Russia will be back to try to finish the job. And all this costs a lot of money. And I believe in an interview recently, President Zelensky made this point about the personnel costs of having a large armed forces. And when we talk about providing assistance to Ukraine, we often talk about 155 millimeter shells and other platforms, F-16s, Patriots, etc. But I suspect just as important for the Ukrainian armed forces is making sure that those who are serving are paid well, compensated, benefits, knowing that they're going to be looked after and their families will be looked after if they're wounded or if God forbid they are killed. So I think in the longer term we need to look at the Ukrainians will have to look at this. So the other issues were largely touched upon already. Well, I would put a emphasis on the need for SHORAD, short-range air defense capabilities that George mentioned. This is a crucial capability gap, in my opinion. General Clark mentioned, this is still, despite the FPV drones and the proliferation of the use of unmanned systems, this is still a artillery intense conflict. And a lot of focus has been on the 155s. But another issue that's not perhaps as glamorous are the barrels and the shortages of barrels and the manufacturing capacities of barrel replacement for the artillery systems that are used. And then on the another shortcoming right now is on the the different mobility platforms used by the Ukrainians, especially engineering systems for demining, breaching defensive line. And it's odd that this is still a big issue because this is something that was an issue back in 2023. We're now in 2026. And George highlighted that it's not a continuous front line like imagine watching a World War I movie. Which makes this sort of engineering equipment that much more important. And then longer term, consolidating all the different platforms that have been generously donated to Ukraine. It's not beneficial or cost effective in the long term to operate dozens of different platforms. So in the long term, Ukraine's going to have to think about how they manage their fleet of armored vehicles. I'll stop there. I got a 1 minute mark and a 2 minute mark. I could add that to make 3, but I'll stop.
I'm the moderator. You change it.
Yeah, no, I'm fine. I'm fine. Thank you very much.
Yeah, before we start the questions, I just want to take the prerogative of the moderator. There are 2 things I'd like to ask. Oddly enough, we seem to talk for all of the requirements that are needed. We don't hear anything about counter drone. I mean, the fact is, if we put as much effort into counter drone capabilities, like General Clark said about directed energy, then perhaps the drone challenge would be lessened. If it was said a number of times, the battlefield is evolutionary. You learn, as the Germans did in the Spanish Civil War, how to evolve on the battlefield. But this seems to be a glaring missing point, that we're not getting as much counter drone capability over there as we are other equipment. So I leave that as a question and as a comment. The second thing, and this is going to be completely considered unhelpful, but whether you call it a stalemate, positional, or static, the fact that the battlefield is not moving more than 12 kilometers a day means that it's going to take 46,688 days to take Ukraine. And whether you talk about hedgehog defense or trench line defense, it still kind of looks the same. The Germans tried the hedgehog defense at the end of World War I, and that was still in the context of a static positional stalemate. The fact remains is that Occam's razor may be helpful here, and usually the simplest answer is the correct one. Number one, The center of gravity is not anything on the battlefield. The center of gravity is Vladimir Putin. It's that simple. This war will go on as long as he continues to conduct it, and it won't stop until he changes his mind. The second thing is the operational center of gravity is defeating the Russian army or taking the land. And you take the land, as was said, maneuver warfare, and it's not happening. Defeat the army, you can either kill them, you can exhaust them, or as we've seen with the Russians in the early 20th century, and why they haven't revolted yet is beyond me. So I think we got a long way to go. I know that's a very unpopular comment. I see a lot of the analytical organizations in Washington, D.C. being less analytical and more cheerleader to all of this. But having said all of that, if you take anything away from these comments, keep thinking counter-drone. Who has the first question? Yes, sir. Okay.
Thank you so much. You've all talked about the important nature of important role of technology in the war in Ukraine, and how that's changing from big platforms to smaller technologies, maybe from smaller suppliers. And I wonder if you could comment on the evolving nature of how defense hardware and software is procured, and how that relates to things like sort of the nature of a startup versus a big defense contractor, and how that relates to private capital and the general sort of technology ecosystem you see in places like Silicon Valley, and how that can be helpful. Thank you so much.
Who wants to take that?
I had to get that.
Yeah, go ahead.
You want to do it?
No, my response was gonna be, I think there's a defense procurement panel later that would be best for that, but
Yeah, barring the defense procurement panel, it's later. There's a Luke just said. That's a great question. I think it's very important. There's a lot of lessons to learn from Ukraine, right? I mean, it's remarkable that one of the main manufacturers of interceptors for Ukrainian drones that actually strike the Russian or made Iranian Shahed drones is Eric Schmidt with the MIRAPS program, which is interesting and fascinating that he assembled a team and ponied up the capital and that sort of thing. There's a debate right now on procurement in Ukraine. There's basically one school of thought that says brigades should be responsible for 80% of the brigade's procurement. And then there's another camp that argues that the Ministry of Defense should be responsible for 70 or 80% of a brigade's procurement. And the Ukrainians have essentially set up an Amazon shop called Brave One, where startups can put their products, put it out to the market. The end user actually rates how the product works in the field, and the best products are used and then procured in a larger scale, and then the ones that are not very effective doesn't work. That's a very interesting thing. And then the units, by the way, that get the kills get more points to use on the store. So there's sort of this meritocratic reinforcement loop of, hey, the system worked, you get more of it, your kills translate to a currency in the system. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned here, but it's essentially decentralizing, and it's a different model, and it does seem to have some benefits.
Next question.
Hi there, Yuri Makar, South Dakota. Question is this: basically the point of view of the battlefield, and how. So if there's the battlefield, right, and if I'm assuming there's like mines all over, there's drones all over. How do you go, or other obstacles such as berms or trenches? How does one go about like clearing that? Because you need time to clear mines, right? If there's drones up above, like how does that work? Like you need to progress, you got to get through all these obstacles, lines of defense, whatever, for soldiers or tanks. How do you go about clearing it? There's like all these drones flying around.
yeah.
General Clark, I think you can help us with that.
No, I think it's a really important question. Look, you have to think of this as something like the way the Allies invaded France in 1944. You have to think of it as a set piece. You have to say, I've got to do this, I've got this obstacle, they're going to try to do this, I'm going to have this in order to deal with it. So you've got to know what's out there. You've got to figure out what it takes you to be able to either breach the minefield, fill up the ditch, or go past the dragon's teeth, or blow them up. But then they're going to interfere with you. So what are you going to do to prevent their interfering with your breaching operation? So it's action, reaction, counteraction, and it's about technology development. We didn't do that before the 2023. I say we, the United States, didn't help Ukraine. We didn't really understand it. And yet, if you looked at the 2023 operation, it was exactly like any number of operations we've run in the California desert at the National Training Center. And it was not well thought through at the highest levels. Before Eisenhower invaded Europe, they had looked at the beaches. They knew they had to build an artificial harbor. They had to have tanks that could go through water, so they had to put snorkels on the tanks. They had to have plows on tanks to go through hedgerows. They did many different innovative things trying to deal with what they imagined they'd confront. So you've got to look at the battlefield in depth for maneuver warfare, and you've got to think through what's needed. Most important thing is you've got to get obscuration out there, because if you can't mass, if you can't organize, if you can't pull units together, you can't penetrate. The whole idea is to be able to obscure a portion of the battlefield, mass your forces, go through and get into that soft underbelly, or relatively soft underbelly, that George is talking about in the area where the headquarters are. But to do that, you have to really do your homework. Now, I'm hearing reports that the Ukrainians are doing this in terms of using drones and so forth for breaching. But can it be done quickly? Can it be done at night? Can it be done under obscuration? Can it be put together and coordinated? That's the challenge. In the United States Army, we worked these drills for years to try to learn how to do the obstacle breach. And it's not something that you can simply delegate to a brigade and say, okay, every brigade sort of figure this out on your own, because the brigades are busy fighting. So you've got to have a centralized training system and doctrinal development system that goes through. And this is why I say the core organization is so important here. And so that's the way you've got to have the upper echelons structured so that the soldier at the bottom is supported so he can get through the minefield. No repeat of 2023.
Yeah, I would also add that if you really want to see some good lessons learned and doctrinal processes for doing this in combat, you read the 1st Infantry Division after action report from the first Gulf War. As you remember, they had to breach the largest, most thorough obstacle belt in generally modern history when they went up against Saddam's army, breaking in through that obstacle belt. People rarely talk about what General Rahm and the 1st Infantry Division did because they made it look so easy. 1st Infantry Division, 1991, 45
So
years?
Mark, if I could just
No, 30.
35.
we built that obstacle system out in the California desert. We brought the 1st Infantry Division into practice on it, and that's how they learned it.
And who was running the National Training Center at that time?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I was listening to the panel, and the opinion is that the frontline battlefield ranges from a static battlefield trench warfare to what's reminiscent of Vietnam fire bases, where you have pockets of protection or occupied territories. My question is, and it's more like a comment, is that in World War One, the trench warfare was only, how can I put it, overcome when we had tanks and machine guns that came into play. Okay, very similar today in Ukraine, you have drones. That's the new technology here that is really impacting maneuver warfare, because you can't maneuver forward if you're gonna have a drone come in and zoom on your tank or your infantry unit. And from my perspective, you have to defeat the drones close in within 100 meters or 200 meters of it coming into you, for you to be able to then move forward. If you can do that, the Ukrainian army can progress forward. The other part of that is talked about drone defense and the shot heads. And I think that we have on the US side something called the Avenger, which is a mobile platform that has man pads on it that can be used for those long range tactical drones such as shot heads. So, you know, your comments would be appreciated.
I agree. How's that for a comment?
Yeah.
Yeah, the one thing about, I do agree with you on the need for counter drone, because as many of the panelists, in particular General Clark, said, I mean, if you try to move out and get across, in the old days, all you had to worry about was the wire, the landmines, the direct fires, the artillery coming on you, which was considerable. But now you've got to worry about these first-person drones that have the capability to, if they can see it, which they can kill it. So even if you have all the counter-drone capabilities in the world, you still have a standard obstacle belt in belts, really, of different types that, as General Clark, and I want to echo his comments about something you need to train for. It's a drill, but at a very large level. Usually a division coordinates the conduct of a breach on the battlefield. That's how complicated it is and the span of control is. Going through an obstacle belt is tough. With drones, it's tougher.
Just a quick follow-on and observation to that. In World War I, about 70% or so of the deaths were actually by artillery. And then small arms and machine guns, about 20 or so percent, and the rest is like scattered through other means. And then you look at the situation today in Ukraine, certainly until recently, I think the majority was probably by artillery. And now I think that's, George would know better, but shifted to drones on the battlefield, FPV drones. So it's like what's old is new, what's new is old. The circumstances just are so different from each war. While it's interesting to draw the parallels, sometimes it may not be as it seems.
I'll add one quick comment. In addition to physically destroying the drones, you can defeat the tactics and the effects in detail using deception. So you can actually, drone operators, they have a sortie rate, they have a replenishment rate. The Ukrainians have experimented with attacks where they've actually created a salt lick to attract the attention of all the Russian drone operators, and it's a feint, so that then the actual exploitation force tactically attacks on a different area. So that's another way to get around this too.
Next question. In the back.
One.
Go ahead.
David Blaster, current veteran fellow at the Hoover Institution, and I've been on the ground in Ukraine since 2012, and I've been fighting since 2014. I'm a former U.S. Army combat medic. So I can tell you, and Oleh was a very good friend of mine. Zaryckyj believed in something different. What we need is willing battalion commanders and now regiment commanders who are willing to do something different. I was presented with a field problem of 450 people freshly from prison in a company-sized element, and that's huge for a company, to be stormtroopers to open the Kursk offensive. And he believed enough in doing something different, asked me as an expert in my field what to do. And I said, well, how many combat medics do we have? He goes, we're not going to have any combat medics. We just don't have time to train them. We're not really happy with the combat medic standard, and most combat medics are 5 to 8 kilometers away in an 8-kilometer drone kill box. So we have a 6-hour to 6-day medevac time, and a tourniquet will turn your arm into an amputation in 2 hours. So we're not addressing this. That's actually what I'm addressing at Hoover right now.
Yeah.
So what I've seen, and it's more of an observation, I want to end it. What we need is training models like what you guys did, we'll have in my next module with HR, I'll be talking more about what happened in '91 and that with T-72 tanks when we actually faced those and how that went, how that could have went. What we've seen is the ground level troops need to have a higher level skill set to be able to do tourniquet conversion and replacement, because 35 to 40% of the amputations currently are unnecessary. So that's the easiest way to have victory, because those people have been trained with value, those people fight for the country, and to just come back unnecessarily to have amputations. So I'm going to pontificate or add on to how you would like to.
Thank you. We're gonna have one last question before we give the final question to Walter.
So a prior question was about US systems to defeat Shahed and other incoming Russian drones. The Ukrainians have a lot of their own anti-drone systems, and they can build them for a lot cheaper. If anything, they might have too many of them. Some of them look a lot alike, but how can, in addition to the small number of investors, Western investors that are in Ukraine, how can the West and military and governments help Ukraine scale up their existing working, more cheaply built systems rather than doing expensive Western duplicative systems from scratch? Thank you.
My answer would be give the money to the Ukrainians. They're building small, cheap, and FPV at massive rates, as opposed to, as you say, the American system where we allow better to be the enemy of good and more expensive to be the enemy of cheap.
Sure. I'll just quickly add to that. Also, in addition to investing in Ukraine, bring Ukraine to you. Denmark, I think, is the first country to open a manufacturing facility for a Ukrainian defense company. And they're about ready to launch a second initiative with a different defense companies on drones in Denmark. I think the problem with Ukraine right now, because there is an ongoing conflict, is scaling up in the capacity. And then we could benefit from that. Our defense industries could benefit from that as well by bringing Ukraine out of Ukraine and into our own defense industrial bases.
I actually, because I've listened to all of you in general, I'll probably start with you. And the question that I would have is about personnel. Luke, I'm glad that you put that in. We had the traditional battalion, regiment, brigade, even division separations. Now, in the Ukrainian army, it's now grown to about 700, 800,000. What's the optimal unit in those to be able to do? We're talking about static, but if it becomes dynamic again, is there a point at which we need a particular kind of operational unit, whether it's a brigade, or is there a possibility, because we've seen the air sort of component of land forces moving forward, not obfuscated, but it's just neglected as a result of drone war, or has drone war so effectively stopped air use that we have to stay at a lower level of organizational capability. For instance, regimental and brigade, because I'm hearing a lot of regimental brigade stuff or even battalion, but I'm not hearing anybody thinking on a larger scale, mass operation. And is that a stopper? And I'm told all of you, because all four of you are the best, and General Clark, you're the last general to win a war. It's over in Kosovo. So I think that all of you folks, men, are just about the best to answer this question. Okay,
General Clark.
Well, I think you need a mix. I mean, right now, you're not going to be able to do much to change the structure of what's working in the defensive line. I mean, those guys know they know the terrain. The commanders are determined. They know where the enemy infiltration is. They know how to evacuate, how to get resupplied, and it's working at the brigade level. So that's a good thing. But if you're going to actually take back ground, you're going to to be able to bring in combat multipliers. And it's simply a fact that you've got to have higher echelons to bring those multipliers in, whether it's engineers, jamming, artillery, air support, whatever it is. The guy who's dodging the bullets on the ground and trying to maneuver soldiers up and back can't do everything at once. So he's got to have help from higher echelons. And that's what General Shyriaiev is trying to put together over there. But it's a real tough problem, as George or Luke were saying. It's like trying to build a ship when you're going across the ocean. It's a really tough problem to do this, but it can be done, and it will be done eventually. And if we provide Ukraine the assets it needs so that it can fully equip these higher echelons, they will get the breakthrough. And that breakthrough is what will force Putin to give up on his design.
I'll just say Ukraine's most effective and successful operation of recent, the counter-offensive in Kupiansk, was a higher echelon undertaking. You had multiple brigades. There was actual staff planning. The culmination of that was in November, but there was actually months of shaping that happened in September and October ahead of the actual maneuver phase of that. So it is going to have to be higher echelon activity. I'm sure General Kimmitt has his own thoughts too.
No, I agree with those points. I mean, we call it, to use your term, shaping the battlefield ahead of time, preparation of the battlefield. In the first Gulf War, I think we had an air campaign going on for weeks and weeks, shaping the battlefield before the actual attack went across. So, but going back to your question, I think that most military people would say, what's the right organizational structure? It really depends on the mission, and you got to tailor that force package that you're going to use to what you're facing, and number two, what you're trying to achieve. So I'm not sure there's a one size fits all. Walter?
I must say, I'm just about to say, this is actually, every panel is shaping up to be the same. This is just as good as it ever gets. I really want to thank all for it, because
Thank you, Walter.
Living up to all the expectations of the C-SPAN. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mark, Kimmitt, and
Thank you.
Luke and George. Pleasure to be on with you.
Likewise, thank you, sir.
General Clerk.
Thank you. I'm going to ask, because the coffee is finally